Well, welcome back to Whole Bible Study with me, Taddy Noy, and welcome back to part 2 of a topic discussion: who is the historical Jesus really? And did he die and did he raise from the dead? Before we dive in, let's just take a quick breath and remember where we left off in part 1. We were exploring who Jesus was in history, the real man who walked the roads of Galilee, who taught with authority, and who challenged the systems of his day. We looked at the context of Roman occupation, Jewish religious diversity, and the ways Jesus' message resonated with common people. Now we move to the question that has inspired faith, fueled debate, and divided opinion for centuries. Did Jesus truly die and rise again? The resurrection is not just a theological claim, it is also a historical claim. And that's what makes it unique. Most religions built around ideas or philosophies, but Christianity's earliest preachers, Paul, Peter, and James, rooted their message in a concrete event. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15:14, quote, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith," unquote. This means we can't talk about the historical Jesus without talking about whether this resurrection actually happened. So let's start with what historians generally agree upon. Even highly critical scholars like Bart Ehrman, E.P. Sanders, John Dominic Crossan, and Marcus Borg affirm that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate around 30 CE. The crucifixion is one of the most historically secure facts about Jesus' life, supported by multiple independent sources and consistent with Rome's well-documented use of crucifixion for political rebels. The question is not whether he died. Virtually all historians agree he did, but what happened next? The earliest written testimony we have is from Paul, not the Gospels. Writing roughly 20 years after the crucifixion, Paul records in 1 Corinthians 15 an early creed, likely memorized and recited in Christian gatherings, stating that Jesus, quote, "died for our sins according to the scriptures, was buried and rose again on the third day and appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, unquote. This creed is considered by scholars like James D.G. Dunn to date back to within just a few years, perhaps months, of Jesus' death. That's incredibly close in ancient historical terms. Crossan, however, argues that these early appearance traditions may not refer to bodily encounters, but visionary experiences, profound, transformative events in which Jesus was perceived alive in a spiritual sense. Borg similarly emphasizes that resurrection faith doesn't require a resuscitated corpse, but the conviction that Jesus was vindicated by God and continues to live in a new dimension of existence. These are not denials of resurrection, but different interpretations of what, quote, resurrection meant in first century Jewish mind. It's important here to understand that resurrection, in the Greek, it's anastasis, in Second Temple Judaism did not mean going to heaven after death. It meant the restoration of bodily life after death, the renewal of God's people at the end of the age. Pharisees, unlike Sadducees, held this belief, and the idea was tied to Israel's hope for national restoration. If the disciples claimed Jesus had been raised, they were saying the end-time resurrection had begun in him. Historically, we have several facts most critical scholars agree on. 1, Jesus was crucified and died under Roman authority. 2, he was buried, likely by followers or sympathizers. And 3, shortly afterwards, individuals and groups experienced what they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. And 4, these experiences transformed them from fearful followers into bold proclaimers willing to die for their testimony. The disagreement comes in explaining these experiences. Apologist scholars like N.T. Wright, William Lane Craig, and Gary Habermas argue that the best explanation is that Jesus physically rose. They point to the empty tomb traditions found in Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, and the diversity of appearance accounts. Critics like Crossan counter that empty tomb stories may be later theological creations, noting that Paul never mentions an empty tomb. Ehrman suggests that grief visions, not uncommon in the ancient and modern world, could explain the disciples' conviction without requiring a bodily resurrection. This is where the historical method meets personal interpretation. The resurrection cannot be proven the way we prove a battle took place or a king reigned. What we can do is weigh explanations against the cultural and historical background. And here anthropology matters. First century Jews did not separate body from spirit the way modern Westerners often do. Life was embodied by definition. So if they said resurrected, they were making a claim about embodied life, even if that body was transformed. From a sociological standpoint, the resurrection belief was the movement's catalyst. E.P. Sanders notes that without it, Jesus' mission would likely have ended in obscurity. One more failed messianic revolt crushed by Rome. With it, the movement exploded, reshaping the Mediterranean world. Elaine Pagels reminds us that early Christian diversity included communities that understood resurrection symbolically as the victory of Jesus' teachings in the lives of his followers, alongside those who saw it was literal historical event. This diversity is visible in early writings like the Gospel of Thomas compared to the Gospel of Luke. Dr. James Tabor observes that resurrection faith also carried a dangerous political implication. If Jesus was Lord because God had raised him, Caesar was not. This made the resurrection claim not only theological, but subversively political. E. Burgess, quote, apocalyptic theopolitics, unquote, develops this idea, showing how resurrection belief reframed the world as under God's ultimate authority, undermining imperial propaganda. And then there's the question of the transformation of the disciples. Before the crucifixion, the Gospels showed them fearful, hiding, and in some cases denying they even knew Jesus. Now afterward, they emerged proclaiming him as alive, even when threatened with death themselves. Psychological explanations like grief, hallucinations, struggled to explain this collective transformation, especially in group settings. So where does this leave us as historians and people of faith? The resurrection sits at the crossroads of history and theology. Historically, we can say something happened, something powerful enough to birth a movement, change lives, and redefine reality for those who experienced it. Now, theologically, believers interpret that, quote, something as God's vindication of Jesus, has his message and his mission. For me, this is where humility is important. We live 2,000 years removed from the event. We cannot interview witnesses. We can only examine the sources, weigh the historical context, and acknowledge our own lenses. Crossan and Borg urge us to see resurrection not as a test of whether we accept an ancient miracle, but as an invitation to participate in the life and mission of Jesus now. Others, like Wright and Gaffin Jr., insist it was God's decisive act in history, opening the door to new creation. Now, both perspectives, in their own way, are wrestling with the same truth claim, that death did not have the final word. And that's a message that transcends historical debate. Whether you come up to resurrection through faith, through historical reasoning, or through a blend of both, the heart of the claim is hope, that God's love is stronger than death, and that life not destruction, is the final chapter. I want to thank you for staying with me through these deep explorations. I know we've gone into dense historical, cultural, and theological territory, but my hope is that I give you a fuller picture of what's at stake in the resurrection claim, not just in ancient history, but in our lives today. This isn't just about proving or disproving an event. It's about understanding the heart of the movement that has shaped the world for 2 millennia. I'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, or even your disagreements. Let's keep the conversation going, because the story of Jesus is too important, it's too rich, and it's too full of meaning to explore alone. Thank you again for staying with me through this exercise and through this study, and we will see you in the next chapter tomorrow.